In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up DHCP clients step by step. I'm going to show you the location of the name server config file, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how to configure it on GNS3. All right, starting from scratch, the first thing I'm going to do is drag and drop the NAT cloud onto the topology. I'm going to select GNS3 VM. I'm also going to snap to grid so that I can just get everything lined up properly. Then I'm going to drag and drop a generic Ethernet switch onto the topology, select GNS3 VM. And the next step is I'm going to drag and drop the Ubuntu Docker guest onto the topology. I'm going to use the connection tool to create links. Then I'm going to power on the Linux server and open up the console. First things first is the location of the network settings. And that's where it's going to be. It's going to be at Etsy Network Interfaces. And so we're going to open that up in a text editor. And all we have to do in order to configure this for DHCP is to come down and uncomment those commands just like that. I'm going to hit Control X to save, Y, enter. And then in order to refresh the network settings, I'm going to power off and then power back on the Linux server. Close the console. Yes. Power it back on. Reopen the console. And we can see just like that it has obtained an IP address. ifconfig to verify that we do now have an IP address. And the reason that this was able to work like this is because this NAT cloud has a built-in DHCP server in it. And also by default, it allows you to connect directly to the internet with no additional configuration. So we can ping 8.8.8.8. And we're connected. And because this is a video series for network engineers, I'm going to take it a step farther than that, and we're going to put another server in this topology, and we're going to put it behind a Cisco router and get it connected to the internet as well. So as the next step, I'm going to drag on a Cisco router. I'm going to change the symbol to the classic one that I like. I'm going to double click on the name to change it to R1 so that it's simple. And then I'm going to create a connection to the switch. I'm going to close that window. I'm going to power it on. And I'm going to open up the console to the router. It's going to take a minute for that to boot up. All right, so I turned on interface labels so that we can see what interface is what. And the first step is going to be getting gigabit Ethernet 00 and IP address. And we're going to do this with DHCP. All right, so I've gone into the interface, gigabit 00, IP address DHCP, and no shut. Now you can see that the interface did get an IP address. Do show IP in brief. You can see that interface is up and it has an IP address by DHCP. And our next step is going to be adding another Docker container to the topology. Then I'm going to create a connection from this Docker container to the router. And then I'm going to power on this Docker container. And open up the console. All right, so our next step is going to be configuring DHCP on the router, and then giving our second Ubuntu Docker guest an IP address. with that DHCP configuration and then connecting it to the internet. So the next step is giving interface gigabit 01 on the router and IP address. So we're going to give it IP address 10.0.0.1. No shut the interface. And then the next step is creating a DHCP pool, which I'm going to paste in. All right, so the name of our DHCP pool is pool. This defines the network that we're going to be handing IP addresses out in. This defines the default router, which is going to be the IP address of that interface on R1. And here is the public DNS server that it's going to use for name resolution. And so then the next step is going to be getting our second Docker guest here an IP address. And since this is a blank server, we're just going to do the same thing that we did with the other Docker guest. We'll uncomment those commands. Save the configuration. Then we'll stop and restart it, and then open up the console for it. And this time we can see that it did obtain an IP address here. ifconfig to verify. Okay, now we have an IP address. We can ping the default gateway for this. And I'm going to go back to the router and see if we can ping all right, so the router can ping 8.8.4.4. Can our Docker guest that's on the other side of that router? No, it cannot. And the reason for that is that the NAT cloud does not know that this network exists, that .0/24 network. It doesn't know that it's there. If this NAT cloud was just a normal router, we could configure routing between R1 and that device. But since we can't do that, we need to use NAT. And the first step in configuring NAT is to go back to the router, and we're going to define the outside interface, which is gig 0/0 right here. And then we define that as the IPNet outside interface. And then we define the inside interface, which is going to be 0/1. And then we also need to put in our NAT statement, IPNet inside source list 1, which means we're going to be using access list 1. And our outside interface is 0/0, and we're going to overload. And then lastly, we need to define our access list. All right, now if NAT is working, we should be able to ping that DNS server. And then if we're able to ping our DNS server, we should also be able to ping domain names, which we're able to do so. All right, well, that concludes this video. If you found it helpful, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.